How would you like a cartridge that will throw a bullet 4,500 feet per second and barely recoil, such light recoil that you can see your hits? And the cost of each shot is among the lowest in the business. Well, one just like that exists, and we're going to cover it on this episode of Ron Spomer Outdoors. Hello, everyone. Well, you're probably wondering what this magical mystery cartridge is. Can a cartridge really go 4,500 feet per second, cost hardly anything to shoot, and give you such minimal recoil that you can see the bullet strike the target? Yeah, I think you can, and it's right here, the 204 Ruger. This is not all that popular since it came out. It made a big splash in 2004 when they released it. Hornady and Ruger together came out with that thing. But since then, I haven't heard a heck of a lot about it. But it is really a great varminting cartridge and predator hunting cartridge. I used it exclusively one fall on my coyote hunting and had excellent results. The whole idea is to drive a tiny little bullet really, really fast, and there's almost never pelt damage. The little bullet goes inside, stays inside, and you have got a beautiful, fully organic, biodegradable, and endlessly sustainable source of fur. So I love it for coyote hunting, but it's also extremely effective on the usual varmints. Get out in an alfalfa field with a bunch of ground squirrels, and you can do a lot of shooting for hardly any money because this thing barely burns any powder. And if you're a hand loader, you can really save a bunch of money. And think about the size of the bullets. 30 grain bullets, 40 grain bullets, there's hardly any materials in there. So you get a lot of cartridges with minimal input in your materials. Now, some of us are going to say, well, wait a minute. What is a 204 Ruger? We know the 22 250, the 223, the 220 Swift, the 22 Nosler, the Valkyrie. We're pretty much up on the 22s. And those are your really small varmint cartridges. So what's this 204? Well, as it suggests, it's a 20 caliber. So what they did was they took the 223 and then said, rather than necking that down the way the wildcatters are doing to make it 20, let's do something a little bit better and go with the 222 Remington Magnum, which is a little bit longer case. Otherwise, it would be the 223 neck down to 20. So you don't hear much about the 222 Remington Magnum much anymore, but they resurrected it, pulled that case out of the line, necked it down to 20 caliber, and there's your 204 Ruger. So it's really getting maximum velocity out of a tiny little cartridge. How fast? As I mentioned earlier, 4,500 feet per second. That might sound crazy fast. They get it from their non-leaded NTX bullet from Hornady, and their handloading manual suggests that speed out of a 26-inch barrel. It's a 24 grain bullet. That's why. It doesn't have a lot of downrange trajectory energy and such because of that, but boy, out to 300 yards or so, it is an absolute screamer, and it should work beautifully on a smaller varmint. But most of us are thinking the 204 Ruger was made famous with a 32 grain bullet, and you've got that one right here, the VMAX. And then they upped it to 40 grains, and for a time, I think Berger was even offering a 50 grain bullet in it. But the 30 to 40 grain, that's probably the sweet spot for the 204 Ruger. And it just makes it a mild recoiling, fun to shoot little rifle. And if you're looking for a training rifle for new shooters, or a rifle that you can shoot a lot for your own training for long range stuff and precision shooting with hardly any expense, minimal recoil, this is where the Ruger shines, the 204 Ruger. Now, there aren't a lot of 20 calibers out there. And prior to 2004, I think the only one that was ever on the market was the 5mm Remington rimfire back in the early 70s or late 60s. I remember borrowing one from a friend and taking a Red Fox with it, and I thought it was a really cool cartridge. But I didn't have the money to buy a rifle back in those days, and it sort of disappeared after 3 or 4 years. And that was all you heard about on the 20 calibers for a long time. But the wildcatters were necking down that 222 Remington Magnum. Never really became a commercial cartridge. Then they necked down to 223. That didn't either. I don't know exactly why Ruger Hornady decided to go with that 222 Remington Magnum, longer one, probably just to make it stand out a little more from the Wildcatter's 223 version. But boy, it set the world on fire when it came out in 2004, at least here in the US of A, where we have a lot of varmint shooters and coyote hunters and such. But as I said, since then, you don't hear a lot about it. Now, a lot of us, I think, shy away from the 204 Ruger because we're afraid of wind deflection. We always think those light bullets deflect too much in the wind. But I've got some ballistic numbers we're going to look at, and you might be surprised at how well it does. We're going to compare it against things like the 22-250 and even a surprise cartridge here that's really a lot bigger. Many of you have probably recognized it. I'm not going to mention it just yet. Leave it as a little bit of a surprise here later on. But let's just look at some of the bullets that you can shoot in the 204. I went through a lot of the hand loading manuals and I came up with these. A 24 grain Hornady NTX. The ballistics coefficient on that is really low at 0.170. We're going to see some wind deflection on that one, but that's the one you can drive to 4,500 feet per second. Then you go to the 32 grain ones. The Nosler ballistic tip is a good example. Gets a little bit higher BC at 0.206. A little bit less muzzle velocity, 4,229 feet per second. Then the 35 grain Berger, 0.179, 3,900 feet per second. 36 grain Sierra Blitz King. This is a great bullet. I've used a lot on varmint and coyotes. Pretty high BC, 0.255. And they're still driving that thing 3,840 feet per second. So that's a real performer. 40 grain Nosler ballistic tip, 0.239 on your BC, 3,872 feet per second. 40 grain Hornady VMAX, really high BC, the highest one I found, 0.270. If that's accurate, whew, that's a great bullet, 3,850 feet per second. We're going to see some pretty impressive trajectory performance out of that one. And then a 45 grain Hornady, that one's just a flat base, 0.245, 3,600 feet per second. I was going to run some numbers on the 50 grain Berger, but I couldn't find it anymore. So I think if I was just imagining they made it or if they really did make it, but they're not listing it in their catalog now. So you probably can't find a 50 grain for it. But I think we can do pretty well with these. Now, I do want to talk about the powder dose in here. The reason it's such an expensive cartridge is it only takes around 26 to 29 grains of powder for these various loads. And if you figure a pound of powder weighs 7,000 grains, you divide that by 29 grains, your max load, you're going to get something like 241 reloads out of that 1 pound of powder. You're not going to get that with a 270, I'll tell you that. So the recoil issue is really interesting. If you don't like recoil and you say, well, say for instance the 223, or let's go with the 243 Winchester. That's a pretty mild recoiling little cartridge. A lot of folks like it for coyote hunting and varmints, and it doubles beautifully for deer hunting. 204 Ruger's not going to do that. But for coyote hunting, if you like the recoil of a 243 Winchester, you're absorbing roughly 11 foot-pounds of energy at 9.4 feet per second with an 8-pound rifle. Take that same 8-pound rifle and chamber it for the 204. Guess what you're getting? 3.5 foot-pounds of energy at 5.3 feet per second recoil and velocity. I mean, it's just about nothing. And that's why I say it's great for training and starting new shooters. So let's look at some numbers now on our ballistics. Now that 4,500, if you want to go that fast just to say you've done it, there's your 24 grain NTX bullet. Not going to have the greatest downrange performance, but if you're shooting all of your varmints, say within 300 yards, I think you might be pretty impressed with it. Let's just look at what it's going to do at maximum ordinate of 2 inches. That means the trajectory is going to peak 2 inches high at 150 yards. Oh, heck, on this chart, I only took it to 1.5, so only 1.5 inches. I'm figuring we're shooting some pretty small little ground squirrels out there. So we're going no higher than 1.5 inches at 150 yards. That means at 200 yards, we're still 1.25 inches high, and at 250 yards, we're almost dead on. At 300 yards, 2.28 inches of drop, and at 400 yards, we're dropping 11 inches, a little more than 11 inches. So you can see, really flat. You go farther downrange than that, though, and of course, it really starts to drop because it just plain runs out of energy. But the windage is what's going to get you. So at 200 yards, you're already getting almost 5 inches of wind deflection. That would be a 10-mile-an-hour right angle wind. Almost 5 inches at 300 yards, almost a foot. this is where it becomes problematic. And it's hard to judge the wind and get your good wind calls in there. Now, if you look at the energy column, you'll see, of course, that you really run out of energy. You don't start with that much in the first place, just a bit over 1,000 foot-pounds. But by 300 yards, you're already down to 351. And at 400, you're down to 230. And at 500 yards, 145, you're about like a 40-grain bullet on a 22 long rifle at the muzzle. So there's not a lot of energy there. So that's kind of the limitations of that light bullet. But what happens when you go up to a heavier bullet? Now we're going to go to the 40 grain, which I think is probably your best all-around bullet for this particular load. That one's going to put out 1,300 foot-pounds of energy at the start, and by the time you get to 300 yards, you've still got 648. Coyotes are not going to like that. At 400, you're still over 500 foot-pounds of energy, and at 500 yards, 383. And I think that'll do just fine on your bigger varmints like foxes and coyotes. So I think you've got a viable cartridge for taking those animals at 500 yards if you can get it on target. So what's going to happen with our drops and drifts? Here we're going to that 2-inch max ordinate, 150 yards. And at 300 yards, it's only dropping 2 inches. Pretty much dead on a coyote or a red fox out that distance. And the wind drift is just a little bit over 8 inches at 300 yards. So not too bad. I think you've got a pretty darn viable little predator cartridge out there at that distance. I wouldn't worry at all about the energies. By the time you get to your energies being ineffective, you're probably not reaching that far anyway, past 500 yards. Now we've got to compare this to some of the cartridges that we're familiar with for varmint hunting. I'm going to skip the 223 and go right to the 22-250. That has long been my go-to for coyotes. And it is often described as a matchup for the 204 Ruger. They always say, same trajectory. 204 Ruger, 22-250, Remington. Let's just find out if they really are. Hey guys, if you'd like to get into predator hunting, coyotes, foxes, bobcats, and such, you might want to check out my book, Predator Hunting. It's all about the animals and why they do what they do and how you can call them in and different ways of stalking them and the different cartridges you can use on them and all the other gear, including the calls. So you can find it on Ron Spomer Outdoor Store. That would be ronspomeroutdoors.com. That's my website. And then just go to the RSO store. And if you hurry, I can get you a signed copy in time for Christmas. So what I'm doing is matching up as closely as I can the ballistics coefficient of the bullet and the muzzle velocity. The reason I do that is because those two things determine your trajectory, both the elevation, drops, and the windage. And it doesn't matter what your cartridge is, big, small, fast, slow, as long as those numbers add up, that's what matters. So we know we've got a .270 ballistics coefficient, our 40 grain bullet out of the 204 Ruger. And I came up with a VMAX bullet from the 22-250, a Hornady VMAX at .290. So the 22-250 is going to have a little bit higher BC bullet, but it's going to start out a little bit slower. 3,700 feet per second compared to 3,850 feet per second for the 204 Ruger. So what kind of a difference is that going to make? Once again, we're going to zero that thing so we don't go any higher than 2 inches, and that's at 150 yards. So both of these are peaking 2 inches high at 150 yards. What's going to happen at 300? 2 inches of drop out of the 204 Ruger and 2.5 inches of drop out of the 22-250. So the Ruger's shooting a little bit flatter. Windage got 8.17. So 8 inches of deflection out of the 204 Ruger, 7.9, 8 inches of deflection out of the 22-250. No wonder people are saying that those things have the same trajectory. They do. And it's because they're so similar in their muzzle velocities and their ballistics coefficients. Get out to, well, let's just jump clear out to 500 yards where we've got 25.25 inches of drop out of the 204 Ruger and 26.7 out of the 22-250. So it's actually shooting flatter than the 22-250. So that is a really solid comparison. Folks have been saying that for years, and by golly, it proves out. Now, here's kind of a crazy one. 257 Weatherby Magnum. I mean, that Roy Weatherby used that to shoot a Cape buffalo. So that gives you an idea of the kind of energies and performance you can expect out of this big horse. And we're going to compare it with the little bitty 204 Ruger. Let's just stand those side by side so we can really appreciate what we've got. How can that possibly match up? Well, you might be surprised. What we're going to do is shoot a 75 grain varmint bullet in the 257 Weatherby Magnum. And again, we're sticking with our 40 grain load here in the 204 Ruger. And we're going with that 2-inch max ordinate again. So we've seen the numbers on the Ruger. Let's look at the 257 Weatherby Magnum. At 300 yards, 2 inches of drop. At 2.06 actually, and then compares to 2.07 out of the 204. They are just exactly the same on their drops. That is crazy. And then the energy, of course, you're going to win with this 257 because it's a 75 grain bullet. But as you look down those numbers on your trajectories, your drops and your windage, you're going to see some incredible similarities. At 400 yards, the 257 drops 10.4 inches and the 204 drops 10.56 inches. The wind deflection at 400 yards is 15.3 inches out of the 204 Ruger, and it's 14.26 out of the 257 Weatherby Magnum. So who would have thunk it when you first suggested comparing those two? But ballistically, because of the muzzle velocity and the BCs being so similar, they pretty much scribe the same trajectories. But obviously, you're going to get a lot more downrange energy out of the 257. The question is, do you need it? For varmints, certainly not. For coyotes at extreme ranges, yes, but I think we're good out to 400 or 500 yards with the 204 Ruger, and few of us take coyotes farther than that. It's just too difficult to see them even at that distance in most places where we hunt. So I think we've got a really good, viable cartridge right here for coyotes. As I mentioned, I used it 1 year exclusively in this beautiful Kimber bolt-action rifle and had just perfect success with it. Got all the coyotes I shot at. So what's to complain about? Now, if you are looking for a cartridge that you can use for bragging rights on I've got the fastest one around, get that 204 Ruger. If you want to really minimize the recoil, there you go again. Great for starting new shooters into the centerfire world. Great for individual practice with long range stuff. I mean, if you don't want to be shooting out to 300, 400, 500 yards with your deer rifles, which are pretty expensive to shoot, you get that 204, and with that tiny little powder dosage, if you're reloading those things, they're costing you probably less than 50 cents a shot, I would guess. I haven't priced any components lately, but you can't beat it for small powder doses and small bullets that can't cost a lot. So I really like that round. I only have one rifle left chambered for it, but I'm thinking of getting another one built because it's just such a easy to shoot, fun little cartridge that really does the job. Obviously, you're specializing now in varmints and predators, but most of us like to have a lightweight rifle like that. I've always liked the 22-250 for most of my coyote work, but by golly, when you look at the advantages in this 204, I think I'm going to be starting to shoot that a lot more than 22-250. How about you? Hell, it's up to you. That's the nice thing about this country of ours. We have a lot of choices and a lot of good choices. So if you're looking for one of the least expensive, least recoiling, flattest shooting, fastest shooting cartridges out there for your varmint and predator hunting, you might want to consider the 204 Ruger. This is Ron Spomer. Thanks for listening. Hunt honest and shoot straight.